Hi, everybody. Welcome to Diversity Factors D&I Lab Talk. I can see you coming in surely but steady. I'm just going to paddle a bit here until we have everybody in from the waiting room. And before we kick off with Anja Rose from Maersk Drilling, as you can see here on the screen, hopefully also, I'm going to talk about how to secure an inclusive and caring culture when we get back into the office, or much more likely a hybrid model. So I'm paddling a bit more until everybody is in and we're sure that everybody can see and hear us. Just so you know, this is Diversity Factors D&I Lab Talks, and we record every session, and this is also in order for you to go back if you had any pointers that you want to repeat or so that you can find it on our website at the latest tomorrow. It will also be sent out in our newsletter. Please feel free to use the chat function if you have any questions or comments during the talk with Anja today. We will also pick up in the end for 5 to 10 minutes for any further questions or any comments that you might have. But we will be kicking off in 2 minutes when we're sure that we're just gonna give everybody maybe 2 or more minutes to get in before we start this conversation about ways of working after a pandemic that we're kind of still in, but I'm not gonna maybe talk more about that feeling of COVID fatigue and then instead talk more about hopefully all soon we'll be vaccinated and there will be sun and there will be light again. But yeah, we're slowly but surely having anybody come in. Again, welcome to this Diversity Factors D&I Lab Talk with Anja Rose from Maersk Drilling about how to secure an inclusive and caring culture once we start going back to the office, or probably in a hybrid model. Anja is a friend of the house here in Diversity Factor, and we're very happy that she could come on board to talk to us about how they have done this in Maersk Drilling, both in terms of the first lockdown, but also what the learnings have been and what they're especially paying attention to right now. But I think we will surely kick off. And just so you know, Konstantin is in the chat right now, and he's also behind the screen, and he is the one who is producing these D&I Lab Talks. And therefore, we will say next slide at some point in time, and I'm going to do that just now. So Konstantin, please take us to the next slide. Just a simple PR exercise on Diversity Factor and who house it is you're in right now online. This is Diversity Factor. We're a management consulting agency focused only on diversity and inclusion. And for right now, we are made up by myself and Rasmus and Maria and Konstantin and Jessica. Unfortunately, Konstantin is leaving us. He got a new opportunity in corporate. We will share where he's going later on, but so we have an open position as a DEI consultant right now, actually. But we, if we go to the next slide, we work with companies, both large scale, smaller companies, NGOs, and so forth, on various elements of DEI, all the way from consulting in terms of running an inclusion survey to strategy to structural analysis. But we also do online learning in collaboration with Learning Bank. And then we have our D&I Lab community, where we meet with people on how to improve this conversation, but also learn from each other. And since lockdown started, we have run these online talks as a part of this D&I Lab community, and that's what we're here today. So if we go to the next slide, I will now almost give the word to Anja instead of doing PR for myself. But as I said, Anja is a friend of the house. Anja is the head of diversity and inclusion and talent development, if I'm not mistaken, in Maersk Drilling. And has been on an exciting journey, not only just in terms of diversity and inclusion, but of course, as everybody else, in terms of what happened since 11th of March in Denmark last year, but also globally. Just to give you some perspective also on this recording or this talk, is that we're of course going to talk a lot about going back into the office. Maersk Drilling is not just an office company, it's primarily a drilling rig company. Therefore, the majority of Anja's employees will actually be either in the North Sea or the US Gulf of Mexico and so forth, working on a drilling rig. But we are focusing solely on going into that physical office location in this talk. So I'm going to give the word to Anja for just about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation afterwards around how to do this. And then please feel free again to ask questions in the comment box or in the chat box if you want to, but otherwise we will also wrap up in the end. But Anja, please take it away.
Thank you, Helene, and thanks for having me. And just to add a little bit more PR to your profile, I had, me and my team, we had the pleasure of working together with Helene and Konstantin last year back in October on an inclusion survey as well as an inclusion workshop, where we tackled quite controversial topics at the time, I would say, to have in a corporate setting, with racism and Black Lives Matter and inclusion and sexism as well. And we have actually continued that conversation since then, and also spent March focusing on SDG 5 and gender equality and building more on that conversation. So just want to say, if you are looking to do activities within this area, I can recommend to reach out to Helene.
Oh, I'm happy to hear that.
So if we move into to what Maersk Drilling is doing in this space, and also a bit of background about where we are in the grand scheme of things. As Helene mentioned, we're a drilling company, and it's not really that common for drilling companies to focus on sustainability. But that's actually where I want to center the beginning of this conversation before we move into talking about returning to the office and our experiences during the COVID lockdown, both for onshore, and we also have offshore learnings there and things that we're doing. But we've decided to take a bold stance in this space and actually go and make sustainability one of our top priority areas. So we have two. One is our transformation of our business and our business models and what we're introducing here. And then the other part is actually sustainability, which is quite a big deal in this space. And then when we look at sustainability, we have three sub areas. So we have emissions reductions, completely new. We have our safety culture, which is something that we've been doing for many years, but are continuously working to improve and refine even further. And then finally, we have diversity and inclusion. And we actually worked on our D&I plan and strategy during lockdown, because we started off at the beginning of last year and then actually spent a good deal of months during lockdown finalizing that. So this is also a bit of a testament to what can be done or what can get done and how during a lockdown. But I would say that we can be quite satisfied with that. And some of the things that we have committed to, which in my personal opinion, and also based on learnings from other companies, is setting quite clear targets for female representation in leadership. And I think that for those of us who have been working in this space for a while, we know that it's filled with good intentions, and then when push comes to shove and you are in a hurry to fill a position, or you don't have a diverse top field, we just find that leaders and HR as well are willing to make compromises. And then when you look at the end of the year, how's our progress looking? It's usually not so nice. So this is actually a way for us to really stay the course and be super focused. And it's something that's on top of my agenda, both within diversity and inclusion, but also within talent management and how we source talent, as well as look at filling our senior leadership positions. But we've set a target of 30% female representation in leadership across levels in our onshore organization by 2023. Then for senior leaders, and in my opinion, this is quite bold, but 25%. So this is vice president level and above. And then we have a target of 20% for our executive leadership team. And in January, we got a new CFO into the company, and it's a female. So we are actually at 25% now female representation. Not that that should in any way be stopping us from giving this our full focus moving forward. Another thing that we have also been working quite diligently on and been very successful in is having a balanced board representation. So we have 3 female board members and 4 males. So that is almost 50-50, and we're really pleased with that. We have super competent female board members who have a lot of experience within oil and gas and have I can leverage that experience in order to also influence how we are focusing on our D&I work, which in my personal opinion has just been really, really rewarding as well. When we look at our overall gender distribution, you can see that we are a male-dominated company. And especially for offshore, we do have ways to go. And this is another area where we will be, you can say, without any pun intended, drilling down on what we can do to also attract more women to the offshore workplace. And that is something that we're going to be investigating this year in order to move forward. I would say that we are a quite diverse company when it comes to nationalities. So we have 59 different nationalities represented. I am nearing my 3rd anniversary in Maersk Drilling, and I recall when I started in our head office in Lyngby, it struck me that this is a place where you actually do need to speak English for real, because you are surrounded by a lot of colleagues who come from countries outside of Denmark and Scandinavia, which I think is very inspiring and very motivating, and something that we should continue to harness. So this is what the big picture looks like. The things that we're working on are both related to reaching our targets, but also in building a more inclusive workplace. And we are doing that through inclusive leadership initiatives, looking at flexibility and ways of working, which Helene and I will get back to in the Q&A and in the conversation session, as well as involving the organization through and through in this work. And we've just seen so much interest and so much positive response from the organization across onshore and offshore, which is a testament to the fact that this is something that we need to do and need to do more of. And it's not that this is something that's only of interest to a certain kind of people or a certain cohort, for example, females. One of the things that we've definitely learned is that inclusion and what it means to be a male as well in such an environment where there perhaps is a history of a certain tone is equally as important. And when we do work on inclusion, it's actually everyone who benefits, regardless of how they identify and how they see themselves in terms of personality, preferences, and what it means to be yourself in the workplace. So I just want to show you now, because we reopened our physical office in Lyngby last week, and it opened with a makeover. So if we can go to the next slide, I just want to show you, and I can see that some people on the call are actually ex-Maersk Drilling colleagues. So you might also be surprised to see this space.
I have also spotted those ex-Maersk drillers.
Yes, exactly. So it started last week on the 6th of April, and we had both coffee trucks, breakfast areas, food trucks there as well, and a jazz band playing to really make people feel like you're not just coming back to the regular old office, you're coming back to an experience of all kinds of impressions and just being really, really happy to see your colleagues. So we are aiming to be at about 50% capacity in the office. That's what we think is responsible. And people have it's just been so nice for me personally as well, coming back and seeing your colleagues, and also a bit weary in a way because you've gotten used to a virtual interface. So seeing people in real life is both really fun, but it's also something that you need to get used to. So, but what we've done with the office is we have divided it and given it spaces with different purposes. So we have spaces to connect and to collaborate, as well as spaces to concentrate and to be on your own, actually. And this is very much a result of the insights that also come, which is people have different preferences. Some do their best work when they are in isolation, and maybe they want to peek out for lunch to meet up with their colleagues. But actually, if you need to do deep work, I think that we all can recall from before lockdown how much of a hassle it could be to go into the office, knowing you would get interrupted, knowing there would be a lot of noise, and then feel quite overwhelmed and maybe even a bit stressed at the fact that you had this work to get done. So in my opinion, I think that what we have now is an understanding of people have different needs and we need to respect boundaries and give that space. But then we also have those who really thrive on collaboration and connection and actually do their thinking in conversation with other people. So they depend very much on this connection space. So we've accommodated for that in our new office setup, and the response has been really positive. And of course, there is some getting used to, all depending on how you've been used to working. But all in all, it's really been a good step in the right direction, and actually showing also how we are changing as a company, not just when it comes to when we talk about how we do business or our culture, but also in how we physically in real time do work. So super pleased about this, and can't wait to tell you more about it.
Can't wait to hear more about it.
Yes. So I think that this was my 10-minute intro. I'm going to give the word back to you, Helene.
Thank you, Anja. Konstantin, let's jump off the slides and just have Anja and I on the screen. I think we need to be spotlighted just real quick. Otherwise, I can see a lot of Zoom boxes here, which is also nice. Of course, it's not that. But Anja, I really want to start out by just, what did you do in March? Let's go back a bit and let's just backtrace back a year and then what did you do? Because we were all kind of flabbergasted what was going on. Okay, everybody needs to go home. Everybody go home. And then you're a drilling rig company where you can't go home if you're on Maersk Innovator in the North Sea. That's just not doable unless, of course, there is a shift change. But how do you do shift changes also in a COVID lockdown world? So can you just for a bit of background, what happened in the first lockdown? How do you go about that? How do you created that online inclusion also? How did you started working online, and what are some of the learnings that you took from that?
Yeah. So we had a Corona task force that was put to work before lockdown happened, and who were monitoring the situation very closely. At the same time, it did go very fast on 11th of March. So I recall myself that we were people who were planning, we'll still be in the office tomorrow, even though some are staying home because they have COVID paranoia, right? Yeah. And then it hit, and then it became very serious indeed. So what we did was, people were sent home from one day to the other in the office. And very quickly, our task force, our COVID task force is led by our head of health and safety. And basically this was the communication channel that we had when it came to general orientation. And there were very practical things in the beginning. Oops, I have not learned how to work in Teams, for example. How do I do that? Where can I watch a tutorial on that and get the departments to run intros to that? Then there are practical things like your laptops, computers, and then the modus operandi of each team. So for leaders to go in and say, okay, how put together with their teams and ask, okay, how are we going to be connecting with each other, both on our priorities, on our well-being, and how we get work done. So that was sort of the immediate thing that happened. And then on the rigs, of course, what we saw there was, in the beginning, there were some travel restrictions, but it was still possible to move people to and from the rigs. However, for many, it meant that the shifts were extended. So for those who had been used to 2-week shifts, those would be extended to maybe 3, for some even 4. And of course, we also had not many, but there were a few outbreaks or a few cases, which meant that there was also quarantining going on. And definitely very challenging situations where our HR colleagues who work in manning just did an incredible work in really figuring out how do we transport people back and forth, and also make sure that they preserve some kind of sanity when they are in quarantine. So that has actually also been top of mind. What we did for our leaders especially was sessions on energy management, and actually began to talk about extending that even further. Because for those, for example, who are stuck in a hotel room for 2 weeks in quarantine, some of them actually went out and participated in department sessions telling us about their experience. And there was one colleague who during these 2 weeks was watching a lot of Netflix and got a notification saying you have watched all content now on Netflix. And I can't even begin to imagine that is even possible. But that was actually the case. So
wow.
So those are sort of some of the immediate things that happened. And another thing that we learned quite quickly was there is a difference between being home during lockdown and then working from home as we had been used to up until lockdown. So up until lockdown, you would send your kids to school or to institutions, and you would have quiet time at home to actually do your work. But the difference during lockdown was that everyone got sent home, which meant that people with families would have everyone around them. And this is, of course, something that both put strains on families, on relationships, and worlds just morphed into one space, which in most cases were, either an office or a living room or a kitchen for some. And that was where all of life was taking place. So,
and it's not recommendable in any kind of way, says the lady with a husband and a son that was about to throw them out the window. Okay, back to you, Anja. Sorry.
Exactly. But this brings us to the conversations around what kind of flexibility does everyone need. So this became a topic within the first 2 weeks, I would say, of lockdown, because I think that everyone experienced it, but it was also something that was fed back to us in HR and the culture side, saying this is something that we definitely need to address and communicate on, because people do feel the pressure around it. So this meant that leaders would check in with their team saying, we might have had a certain modus that could be too strict for some when it comes to when do you need to be there for a check-in in the morning, how do you make yourself available during the day, and what will it take in order for everyone to actually feel like they can make space if their spouse needs to take care of the kids or share the duties. So that also became something where the leaders with their teams made upfront agreements on how they would work together.
Yeah. I remember, and you and I also discussed this a bit during, just to everybody, Anja and I had kind of, that the master chef kind of, we cheated a bit and had this conversation a bit over the phone prior this week. But one of the things that we did discuss was, of course, that, and I saw this too, that in the beginning, because everybody was online and because everybody had to check in, and it was an opportunity for everybody to be heard, because we had to go through each team box or each Zoom box and say, okay, how are you today? And how are you today? Meaning that the playing field was suddenly much, much wider than it normally would have been in the physical space, where you have to put your hand up yourself in that meeting. And now the leader was pushed into actually including everybody. But what also happened, and what we discussed, is the backside of that is that suddenly our calendars were filled with back-to-back meetings on Teams. And if I look at a normal workday before the pandemic, I didn't have that. I had meetings, it's not that. And I had back-to-back meetings also, but suddenly it was from like 8 to 5. And I was like, what and then I remember reading articles saying, remember to go for a walk or something like that. I'm like, when am I supposed to go for a walk? I'm on Teams or Zoom or whatever it's called from 8 to 5 every day, and my kid is in kindergarten, so I didn't have that school issue, for example, under the second lockdown. But it was like the need to be around people because we sat at home feeling isolated meant that we put everything and anything into that online world and just sat there and stared at the camera. I remember you talked about this also. How has that felt in Maersk Drilling? How have you experienced it? What have some of your colleagues said about that? That thing that we suddenly had online meetings all the time from 8 to 5.
I definitely experienced that there was huge inflation in meetings. And it was the back-to-back setup, and I'm not going to lie, that is something that we still need to work on. So now that we are transitioning to a more hybrid model, that is something to consider. And it's also part of giving people space, right? Because I'm sure that many have also wondered, okay, well, it's great with these meetings and I'm seeing my colleagues, but also my eyesight is hurting. And and I actually have production work to get done. And when and how am I going to make space for that when I'm super fatigued on top of all these meetings? So this has also been, I guess it would be about midway through, people did start speaking up about this, I would say. And where we did have team sessions saying, okay, well, which meetings do we actually not need to have in our calendars? Or should we loosen up on this model because people were actually getting stressed by all of these meetings? And it's something that, you know, just because we were in lockdown, in our case, our ambition level didn't change.
No, it's Maersk.
It's Maersk, right? And I've spoken to colleagues from other sectors where the experience has actually been different, where I heard stories of they had their leadership team saying, okay, everybody calm down, we're going to be working at lower capacity, especially in sectors where there is a lot of face time, which meant that these peers were experiencing the lockdown in a very different way from what we were, which is interesting. So, but I think that it did require us to say, okay, well, we have no clue what's going on, but we are determined to smash all of our goals and do a really, really good job. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, how am I actually feeling? How's my brain? How is my body doing? How are my relationships? And the learning was people do need more space, and you need breathing space, you need space to take a walk. I completely second what you said about that. I got into a habit personally of having calls with colleagues at 8 in the evening. I did put Teams on my phone, and then I took a walk while I was having these calls. But these boundaries were just completely blurred during this period.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw that too, and we saw it with a lot of clients. But now we're going back. So you're ramping up to 50% capacity. You redesigned a bit of the office to kind of make sure that you had different spaces. But in that hybrid model, what do we leave from the old world where performance was based on are you present at your desk from 9 to 5 to now to the online world where leaders actually then had to base performance on output and results because they couldn't no longer see their employees at the desk. And I can't help but wonder if all those back-to-back meetings was a way to kind of figure out if our employees were actually working or not. Was this the same way that we kind of just look over to the next desk and see, okay, you're working, so thereby you're performing. Okay, you're on Teams now from 8 to 5, thereby you're performing. So what do we skip from the entire old world, and what do we take from the online world, but what do we also leave in the online world? Because one of the things, and we also talked about this prior, is, and I do it, and I do it right now even, I can't stop it, is that feeling of being on camera all the time makes me so conscious about how I look. And I'm the vice chair in an NGO called DGPB that works with young girls on how to get involved in STEM, IT, technique, and so forth. And we did a lot of online workshops with them because we couldn't meet with them. So we taught them how to code and so forth. And what we had to face is, and these are girls in the age from 8 to 14, and what we had to face was that we really had to turn off the camera because they got so self-conscious, even these young girls. And I can see it right now. I have an issue with looking at you and then, okay, is my hair okay? Do I look like an idiot? How do I look when I talk and so forth? So what do we skip from the entire, I know it's a big question now, I rambled on also a bit, but from the old world, what do we skip? What do we leave in the online world? And what do we take away then in that new hybrid model? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I very much agree that we should say goodbye to presenteeism forever. It's something that we actually discussed a lot prior to lockdown, because in leadership and in talent, we talk about the difference between what is called emergent leadership, which is standing out, being really, really good at managing up and being good in those real-time interactions and being very convincing and really showing your work, versus effective leadership, which is about actually doing the work and getting it done perhaps more behind the scenes. And I think that what we've definitely reached in the conclusion is, first of all, there's not a lot of overlap between these two types of leadership styles. So it's very difficult to capture both, although I would say you do need to have a little bit of both. But we have a tendency to focus too much on the presenteeism part. And that is something that we've had to leave behind. So I think that's been very good for diversity and inclusion, actually, because when you can't wrap things up a certain way in interactions and put all these things on top to look good, then what it boils down to is the quality of your work and how that actually looks. So I think it actually has been contributing to leveling the playing field just a bit more in terms of what is the difference between seeming confident and then actually being competent on the other hand. So those are some of the things that I think that we should definitely take away from this, because we are restricted in a virtual world from some of the impressions that would usually actually cause bias towards certain kinds of candidates, for example, as well. Then I think that one of the things that came out of it for us was how you communicate and how you facilitate meetings, for example, and conversations and decisions. They have to be much better thought out in a virtual setting. And I think that a lot of people got a really good crash course in becoming better at this, actually. And that is something that's a positive that has emerged, because I think that we've gained a better understanding of what is a good meeting. What is an effective meeting? How do you get to a decision? How do you prepare people in a way that you can actually get to the point and have the right conversation, versus in a more, in the old world, things that would take 3 to 5 meetings might take 1 or 2 meetings in a virtual setting, because people have also become more aware of their time spent and want to be more economical in how they spend it. So those things actually place different demands on us as well. And I think that that's something that's good to take with us. I think a thing that, something that we've been discussing is, are we transitioning to an entirely virtual world where we see places like Facebook, for example, allowing all of their employees to work from home, or transitioning to a permanently virtual model? And I think, and this is maybe also me drawing on my background as a psychologist, but it changes your experience of relationships when you are in a virtual setting. And we can, I mean, in theory, we could do almost any kind of office work virtually, but it doesn't mean that we should.
No.
Because the things that we get when we are physically together gives us so many more stimuli, impressions, memories, and boosts compared to what you get in a virtual setting. And for example, with our leadership development framework, but also talent development, we had to transition our activities to a virtual format, but it should not be a substitute for it, because building relationships, you can get to a certain place online, but you can't go all the way. And actually, this is something that we also got feedback on, because we have had colleagues who started in Maersk Drilling during lockdown. And although good programs were put into place, it takes longer to build and deepen your relationships at work and really get to know the organization when you're sitting from home and you just rely on meetings and one-to-ones. So I think that's really important to be aware of moving forward as well.
Yeah. We have a question in the chat that I want to just get in there now. What are some practical tips to manage multi-locations, I'm going to say, I can't say that in English, schedules, because Denmark is now moving further and further out of lockdown. We even took a vaccine away from the market because we have so good control over the pandemic. I'm not going to comment on that. But you could also have colleagues in other parts of the world. I know US is further along on the vaccines also, but you also have colleagues in Poland, for example, where this is not in any way as it is in Denmark, and these are onshore colleagues also.
Yeah.
How are you ramping up? How are you doing that? Is that based on local? How they ramp up a local HR, or what do you do there? Because there is of course always that global minimum Maersk Drilling standard, and then that is trickled down into the different regions and different markets. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, different countries have local restrictions that we need to follow as sort of the primary guider. So the way that we are working with it is accommodating the different schedules and the different restrictions in a flexible way, which means that for those, I think that one of the things that is also very clear from all of this is the need for collaboration across boundaries, across functions, and across locations. But it's about finding out what works best for the majority. So being a bit utilitarian in it in a way, and actually the way that we've done it is we've asked around for those where we said, okay, which connections are the most important to maintain, and where you need people in real time talking. And we have time differences to accommodate for, conflicting schedules and so on. But it does start with the question about, okay, well, what do we need and what will work best? And then actually work it into a model. But one of the things that we've also become very clear on is that very few models last forever once you put them into practice. So it's evaluation, maybe it's month to month or quarter to quarter, and having also a more pragmatic approach, but saying what's most important right now and who needs to connect, and what is a way that we can make everyone able to participate. And of course, in this case, it's virtually, but it's also something around timing and format as well.
I want to dive into, and we touched a bit about this, but you, as you said in the beginning, now we all remember 11th of March, and there was like, you can work from home, but we're going to go to work tomorrow anyway. The paranoia. And is it paranoia, or should we just all get it because it's just like the flu? And I think we all remember those conversations a year ago, and then boom, you're in 2020 and there's a pandemic going on. Like, what the effing God? So now we're ramping up. We're going back. Everybody has to get out of the sweats. Everybody has to get into traffic again. Everybody has to go down into the subway. Kind of. I know it's a 50-50, or you're just on 50% capacity, but still. And if you're like me, you're standing there, and I am in the office. We get tested 3 times a week in Diversity Factor just to be in the office, because I want to get out. I can't be at home. I'm not good at this. However, I do see friends and colleagues who have benefited from this and are like, yay, can I just be at home? Those human factors that for a year now, we have not been dependent on having to block our calendars in order to leave to pick up our kids. We have not been depending on whether or not we are going out into rush hour in order to get to the next meeting and so forth. We could just be at home in our sweats. And maybe you also have colleagues where this was not just paranoia, but where they actually lost family members or friends to this pandemic, came rolling in, grandparents and so forth. So when we talk about a caring culture, and when we talk about how leaders are, and HR also in structural terms, as we talked about schedules and flexibilities, both in terms of the physical environment, but also how we host meetings. What is your advice to leaders? Because one of the things I have spent a lot of the past year advising leaders on is to act with empathy and say, okay, try to start out a meeting by saying, how are you doing actually? How are you today? Are you okay? But now they have to take into account whether or not you're like me and just want to get out of the office, or you're like some of my colleagues who are like, can I just please stay at home in my sweats because I'm actually more productive and I don't want to go into that office noise? That's one thing. But also the potential scare that some people might still feel. I don't want to go into a subway, even though I wear a face mask. I'm not vaccinated yet. How do you cater for that? I know it's a big question, and I'm not expecting the right solution, but I think that is I think that's worrying for many, and I don't think it's something that we potentially discuss that much. That going back fear, actually.
Yeah, there's the going back fear, and then there's the ambivalence. I think that a lot of people feel, and you don't really know how people are actually doing when you see them on screen in a meeting, and you don't get that feel for where people are. And I think that what I've experienced is also, people develop because you get acclimatized to this way of working, and then having to go back into the office all of a sudden. I mean, one thing is the concern around, is it safe enough? And people have different boundaries there in terms of, or thresholds for when they feel safe. But then there's also the inconvenience that it brings. It's having spent all this time and developing a very deep sense of self-awareness due to watching yourself on a screen, maybe also feeling like you've changed look-wise. There's corona weight gain, or just looking tired and not really feeling yourself. And I think that we should pay attention to not undermining these factors, because they do matter a lot. And like you mentioned, with the girls and how their well-being, I did see that there was a study around how the anxiety levels, depression, and even suicide risk among young females has increased. But we do also see it in other cohorts. So it's not only limited to those who are the most vulnerable to coronavirus, but it's for everyone around them. People have different experiences and are suffering more than we think. So in terms of what leaders can do, our learning so far have been that it's very important what your own behavior is. So inspire the fact that you might either want to stay more at home or want to go into the office. It's important to note that people are going to be looking at what you're doing and seeing that as a proxy for what they should be doing.
Yeah.
So that role modeling and self-awareness is super important, I think, because otherwise, one of the things that are also part of this has to do with job security. And people do worry, okay, well, what's going to happen to my job? Is it going to be automated completely? Or if I can't show my work the way I've been used to, and I'm not good at managing up or connecting so much with my leader or other stakeholders, that can create anxiety as well when it comes to feeling safe in your occupation. So that's another thing I think that's important to keep in mind. And then there's the whole, you said empathy, and I think that's a really good word, and asking questions and really checking in with your team, but have it balanced, of course, because for some, it's almost re-traumatizing to be asked frequently how they're doing. So you can get the question, how you're doing, just, I don't want to talk about it, right?
I don't want to go there anymore. I just want to move on. Give me a shot and then let me move on, right? Yeah.
So some have that. So I think that for leaders, this is really the challenge and the opportunity of really practicing and exercising that empathy muscle, figuring out what inclusion means to each of your team members. And of course, then the art becomes to tie it together in a way that everyone feels that their needs are accommodated. I think that there's a lot of value in bringing the teams together. We do this a lot, both in our team, but also across the organization, in just having more open-ended session. And that can be sessions, for example, on brainstorming on ideas or discussing topics that we're deep diving into, as opposed to just being in production mode, which is another pitfall. I think it can be that we focus very much on the immediate to-dos, but then we lack inspiration for the bigger picture. And being confined, we really need that big picture, and we really need that space to interact with each other. And I think that those sessions are the ones that come the closest to maybe how it used to be if we had idea or ideation sessions, for example, in the teams. So I would say for leaders, I think it's good to make sure that you have a divide between what is status and progress updates and what is time with the team and individuals in order to make them feel seen and also heard in all of this.
Coming from an HR perspective, how do you tackle this in a structural level? How do you cater for it? You write out policies, a good old-fashioned HR policy. As you can probably hear, this is not something that I maybe would recommend, that this is the way to tackle it. But of course, there is also that structural level that goes into securing the foundation for that inclusive and caring culture, especially when we work in a hybrid model. And now you have done something in terms of the physical location and so forth, but in terms of mental health and so forth, how can HR be a proactive ally to leaders, first and foremost, in this coming back to work, but also to the organization and employees as such?
Yeah, so like you said, it's important to work both at the everyday and the cultural level, but then there's also the structural level. And I think that we need to balance actually between those two factors, because it's very straightforward to make a policy, but I think that what we also learned is that policies, not all policies benefit everyone equally. So we need guidelines, and then we need flexibility. And that is something that we are trying to do. So we've worked on the physical workspace, but we're also, I mean, just looking at our employee handbook, that is another project for us, because, and I think it is for most companies, saying, okay, how work was set up and expected to be done in the past, that is no longer the case. And in many ways, when I read these booklets, I'm just thinking, thank goodness for that, because that was not very inclusive towards many people. And it also explains why inequality has developed in organizations. So from an HR perspective, it's very much about balancing between, I mean, policies, but more leaning towards guidelines, but also making sure, of course, that it is taken seriously by leaders. I think there's a huge opportunity for HR to actually go in and affect this space much more. One of the things that we've been doing is also incorporating questions around well-being in our quarterly engagement survey, in order to give leaders and HR partners a bit of data and input on, well, where's the itch? What are people saying? And one of the things that came out of it for us had very much to do with the connectivity part between people. So what is stressful, or what is affecting well-being? Well, it is the lack of human connection, or the insufficiency of human connection. So that is something that we took as input to say, okay, this is something that is going to be on the leaders' agenda over these next couple of months, to really make sure that we fix this, or we improve it at least, and accommodate these needs. So I think that there's opportunities in those measurements for HR to really use to shape both policy and guidelines and support the leaders to a greater extent. And then I think we also have opportunities within organizational design, for example, and how we map out teams. And I think that we've become much more aware of the capability side, and about what it actually means to be very sharp on what our key capability needs are, and make sure that that is where we're focusing both upskilling and development of our people, and really leaning towards the future in that sense. So of course, digitization is sort of a mega trend around this, but I think that this is an area that there's a lot of potential in for HR to go in and influence and work more on with the leaders.
Yeah, and then it is, as you say, it's a clean slate for building a more equal and more inclusive structure, but also culture. And I know, of course, when you, instead of sending out a policy, that if you start by sending out guidelines, you are actually prompting leaders to also be at a more forefront space in terms of this, because it's much, much easier with policies. Then we can just slam people across the head and say, well, you didn't hire by the policy. But by developing guidelines and doing that, leaning towards a more co-creation, flexible space where the individual leader can also lead in terms of his or hers or their individual team, of course, it leads to greater responsibility to the leaders and gives them greater responsibility for that culture. But it is, as you say, an open playing field and a clean slate then for HR to actually push that inclusive culture. And I think that's really, really great. There is 10 minutes left of the chat, and I just want to say if there's any questions to Anja or to me, please jump into the chat and leave them there, or feel free to unmute and jump in and break us up if you have any questions, but otherwise put them in the chat. But I do have one question that I really want to ask, because it was one thing that we actually discussed with a client this week, and it's also one of the things that I've spent a lot of time pondering about. Not just in the online inclusion world or in the hybrid world, but actually also before, because we were talking about how do we make decisions going forward, especially how do we make decisions in a hybrid model where you potentially in a meeting room have 3 present in the meeting room and then you have 3 on the screen. Just to say that, to give an example. And how do you, first of all, ensure that you include those who are online on the screen together with persons who are physical in the meeting? So that's one thing. And the reason why I'm asking it is because my experience from working in organizations, and just also my own, is when do we actually take decisions? Now, I remember when I used to work, and I didn't say this in the beginning, but I used to work in Maersk Drilling. That was before you started working in Maersk Drilling, but we come from the same stomping grounds. And I got my son very late. I was 44, and I was the head of comms and sustainability in Maersk Drilling. And because I didn't have that obligation that I had to leave early to pick up my kid, I was often sitting at my desk after all the back-to-back meetings or whatever it was from 4 to 6. And that was where all those, not big decision, it was not a capital allocation decision, it was not approval of the annual result, that's not what I'm saying, but it was all these itsy teeny tiny decisions that go into the operational wheel of every company, and that has a tremendous ripple effect. And we could maybe have had a meeting prior in that day that was formalized about a certain thing and about where we actually were supposed to take a certain decision. And then 5 hours later, it was late afternoon. And then it was much, much easier to just meet around the desk and say, okay, you do this and I do that. And then the next day, those who had to pick up their kid came into work and they were like, but no, we decided.
Yeah.
How do you... Because that was so hard before pandemic. Then we became online, and now we're going into a hybrid model where some people will be online and some people will be in the meeting room, and we have still not learned how to take inclusive decisions.
No, and it was both hard and it was also unfair and unjust and not very inclusive. Yeah, so exactly. I completely agree with you. And one of the things that we discovered when we were developing our D&I strategy was about decision making, and where decisions making takes place outside of the meetings and between people who know each other well and who already talk outside of work, and then get together without the people who maybe should be there and make a decision. And you know, what you're risking there is both lack of inclusion, but also poor decisions. So I think that the learning here is that we need a much more structured approach to decision making. And when decision making is not taking place in the settings where they should be, we need to ask, why is this happening? Is there a lack of psychological safety, for example, that is preventing complete transparency and openness, which personally I think is a root cause of many of these challenges? Then we need those things on the table. But I think it's also a task for leaders to be really good choreographers of conversations and decision making. Because when it's loose, this is back to the communication part, when it's a bit loose and people don't know exactly what is expected, what are we trying to work towards, what are the data points that we need to take into account, and then in a systematic way make sure that everyone is heard, then that is not going to happen. So it does require a lot of discipline, but I think that the question begins with, what are we trying to achieve? What kind of input do we need to hear? And how do we make sure that everyone is in the room and we develop the discipline and the psychological safety to actually facilitate these processes and then stick to it? Because it is a transition. If you haven't been used to that before, then this is going to be difficult and challenging, maybe even a bit anxiety provoking, because some meetings and some conversations don't go as expected, regardless of how well you planned. But it doesn't mean you should stop trying, right?
No, and inclusion and creating equality is like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's what we normally say also, and it is a learning journey for many. But I totally agree with that. It is, and I think that is a really, really good point. That is a matter of creating that psychological safe space, but at the same time also be very, very specific on leading and choreographing a meeting and being very, very ambitious of what is the end goal and how do I facilitate us getting to that end goal. But that actually also then requires that leaders are there to lead.
Yeah.
And that is maybe my final question for you before we let everybody off is, have you seen a shift in this where, because I remember being a leader and then still having production assignments that were massive still, and I was good at delegating. It's not that, Jesus Christ, I would hand everything off I could get to hand off. It was not that, because leaders were now forced in this lockdown world to actually go in and act with empathy. Have you seen also a shift there where we, from a structural point of view of HR at least, have tried to say, okay, leaders are there to lead. They're there to facilitate an environment of psychological safety, of inclusion, making sure that everybody is heard, facilitating the meetings in the right way so we get the right decision and we make decisions in the meeting where everybody is present and so forth. And we maybe need to scale back on their KPIs in terms of operations. Have you seen that shift yet, or do you think it's coming?
In some places, in some places I definitely have, and I think it fits very well with the development that we've seen, where on the one hand, it's very clear that you can't do everything yourself, but you also need to protect the time of your employees and really need to ask these tasks out of them, what is actually essential and where would it not hurt to not even do it? So if we are, and there's sort of a shift in production orientation, what does that actually mean? I think that we're shifting from volume to quality. And really narrowing that down. I think that the leaders who are really going to thrive in that new normal are the ones who actually understand challenging what's the volume of tasks, but what is the bigger goal that we need to achieve, because purpose has also become so much more important for people. And we need to make sure that there's a fine balance between output and production work, but also thinking work, creativity, and thinking about that next step ahead. And I think I also see that in the development of how we see what's a good leader. And a good leader before used to be someone who was very visible, who had all the answers, and who was just pushing forward, right? And now we're seeing it's curiosity, it's empathy, and it's inclusion of the team where you deliver together that is actually both beneficial to business, but also to quality of life.
Exactly. Anja, I will, on that note, because I think that's a fine way of signing off on how to go back with a more caring and inclusive culture. Anja, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspectives to how to do this. We have recorded it. We will send it out in the newsletter tomorrow and make it available for our website if you want to go back and rewatch it, or send it to some of your colleagues on how to go forward with this. But again, Anja, thank you so much for having this talk with us, and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for a really good conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
That's good to hear. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.